This week we're going to be talking about an issue that's been plaguing me since the inception of Noia and trying to make an MMO as a single developer. We're going to talk about math. Let's get into this. So the problem that we're talking about this week is actually balance, and it's a problem that plagues all MMOs and games since the beginning of time. Trying to balance 4 different stats as well as weapon attack and dodge and block across all the different monsters, as well as trying to balance loot and drops and experience and all of that fun stuff is a very daunting task for a single person to try and figure out. And it's something that has weighed heavily on my mind as something that it's for a future Dane to figure out. And well,
future's now, old man.
Balancing a game as a single developer is going to be a giant nightmare, or at least I thought it was going to be until I discovered math. Before we get into exactly how I managed to solve this problem for myself, I actually wanted to dig into the mechanics of how damage and everything is actually formulated in Noia. The damage formula in Noia actually follows very closely to the damage formula in another game that I played a whole lot of, and that's MapleStory. In MapleStory, classes have two stats that they focus on, their primary and their secondary. For strength, the secondary stat is dex, and for dex, the secondary stat is strength. For int, the secondary stat is wisdom, and for wisdom, the secondary stat is int. As you can see here, monsters actually just do straight damage, and it makes their damage calculations a lot simpler to understand. In the damage formula itself, you can see here that it is 4 times the primary stat plus the secondary stat plus 1, and just to make sure that there's no zeros going on here. And that is multiplied by the player's weapon damage divided by 100. What this gives us is a logarithmic damage scaling upwards. The more stats you get, your damage will exponentially increase. This can be an issue at much higher levels, where the difference between doing 10,000 damage and doing 100,000 damage is only a few stat points. So it's going to be up to me to make sure that that logarithmic scale does not go off the rails. So based on these stats, we can actually calculate the combat damage that a player will be doing, and you see that reflected in the player's profile window here. There's one other stat that we haven't covered yet, and that is called Weapon Mastery. And Weapon Mastery is essentially how likely the player is to hit for max damage. And I'll show how that works into the combat formula here. So in Noia, when one entity deals damage to another, this is the process that it goes through here. First, it checks if said entity is invincible. After that, it rolls the dodge chance. Certain classes will have a more of a dodge tank ability than just straight taking damage to the face. After that, it takes the entity's maximum damage. This is the damage that is calculated based on the entity's stats and weapon attack. That is your top end damage, and it multiplies that against the weapon mastery, which is anywhere between 0 and 100%. It will pick a random number between those two numbers at this point. So you have your low end and your top end, and the damage dealt is randomized between those. Once we've calculated the actual damage that will be passed through, then we calculate damage mitigation based on level difference. If you're lower level than the monster that you're trying to hit, you're going to do less damage. If you are higher than the level of the monster that you're trying to hit, you will do more damage. Currently, the level difference scales from -20 to +20, meaning if you are 20 levels above the monster you're hitting, you're actually going to be doing 2 times damage. And if same goes back to a monster that's hitting you. At the same time, if you are trying to hit a monster that is 20 levels above you, you're going to be doing essentially 0% damage. After we calculate the difference in levels, then it is time to calculate whether or not we hit a critical. As of right now, there is no mitigation or critical mitigation in the game, so you have just as much of a chance to critically hit a level 1 rabbit as you do level 20 God of Chaos. After we determine if the damage is going to be critical or not, then we move on to defense. Defense is just a straight reduction in damage. So if you get hit for 1,000 damage and you have 100 defense, you get hit for 900 damage. After all that, the damage is then applied to the entity that is the target of the attack. If the entity's HP hits 0, it is dead. So now that you know how the damage and everything is actually done, let's talk about balancing. So this is a problem that plagues most game developers with a game of this scope, is trying to figure out how to fit all of this stuff in a cohesive puzzle that the player can essentially enjoy. So back when I was developing Minecraft mods, I had to be able to figure out how to attach a joint together using trigonometry. And because in Minecraft there's no such thing as a joint. In fact, the arms of the model are actually free floating in 3D space. They are attached to the model using trigonometry there. And if you want to add an elbow to a Minecraft model, you have to figure out where in 3D space to snap the forearm to the upper arm of your model. And what I used was actually a website called Desmos. So in Desmos, you can actually set up these formulae here and then create these different variables and sliders, and you can get an idea for how things are going to look on a graph. And what I was able to do in my Minecraft mod is put in different variables here and figure out how far to swing an arm or how far to make a character jump using trigonometry in this graphing function. Well, I was able to use this exact same website to essentially plot out how I want damage to scale in Noia. So as you can see here down at the very bottom, this is our damage formula, which is represented by the white line. At level 1, you're going to be doing very little damage, and at level 50 I want you to be doing around 900 to 1,000 damage. And you can also see here that I have 3 other lines. These represent the orange being the primary stat, green being the secondary stat, and purple being the weapon attack stat. All of these being laid out on these 3 different sliders here that I can adjust back and forth to make the entire system move and shift. So by doing this, once I have this set out to be exactly how I want it to look, then I can go back and plot pieces of gear based on these stat lines. This essentially has created the entire foundation of the combat system and gear progression system for Noia. Those 4 lines essentially create the entire foundation of the combat and loot and progression system of Noia. And I cannot express how cool that is, because with those 4 lines, I can now plot out the progression of everything. So now, if I want to create a level 20 item, I know that the stats on it need to add up to somewhere around 106. The secondary stat needs to be somewhere around 50, and the weapon attack, if we're planning on a weapon, needs to be around 30. Those numbers don't have to be exact. I can essentially shotgun scatter around those 3 stat lines, and as long as I follow those lines relatively closely, the end result will be the same exact damage curve that you saw in the graph. This makes my life easy. I don't know how to express in words any better to explain to you just how happy that this little graph makes me, because it solves so many problems for balancing, and it makes going back and tweaking things and making tiny little changes so much easier for me, that I can just come in here and play with the sliders a little bit and then translate that directly into Unity that'll affect the entire system of the game. So that's all for this week. Now that we have our foundation laid for the combat system and stats, now we got to generate some loot. So we'll see you next time.